The moment of true clarity for a distant partner doesn't arrive when you're pleading for it. It arrives in the profound stillness you create by walking away. Have you ever been bewildered watching someone who once shared intimacy retreat into a shell of indifference, seemingly untouched by the void they've created? You're left swirling in a storm of emotion while they appear calm, detached, even free. Let me reframe this entire dynamic for you in a way that will bring instant understanding. The person who pulls away does not comprehend your significance while you remain within reach. That awakening doesn't occur amidst your availability, your explanations, or your attempts to bridge the gap. No, their revelation is born in the vacuum of your absence. It germinates in solitude. It blossoms when the constant hum of interaction finally ceases. That is when the mirror turns toward them. You see, an avoidant pattern is a fortress built for emotional survival. These individuals are experts at severing connection the moment closeness begins to feel overwhelming. This isn't a reflection of your failure. It's a reaction to intimacy, pressing on wounds they are unequipped to heal. Their primal instinct is to withdraw, to silence, to flee, and in that moment, they genuinely believe the distance is their shield, that silence is their sanctuary. But here is the profound truth few acknowledge. For the avoidant, silence initially feels like liberation, but with time it morphs into a confinement of their own making. At first there's relief. No more messages, no more calls, no more emotional summons. It feels like regained autonomy. What they fail to grasp is that you have just crafted the perfect conditions for a deep, unsettling awareness to take root. Not on your schedule, but on a timeline dictated by their own subconscious. And here's the pivotal insight. They are not stirred by reason. They are stirred by tangible loss. When you were pursuing, when your heart was open and present, they could not perceive your value. Your nearness was filtered through a lens of fear. But when you depart, truly, definitively depart, they are compelled to sit with the very thing they've spent a lifetime evading, their own inner world. That quiet expanse becomes fertile ground for regret, for truth, for a confrontation with the self. The detachment they wielded as a weapon against connection becomes the same force that highlights their own emotional hollow. You assume they're fine because they aren't contacting you. Reconsider. Avoidants do not process anguish externally. They absorb it. They section it off. But it seeps into their focus, their rest, their mental peace, and suddenly the space they insisted they needed transforms into a burden they cannot bear. This is why your silence carries more weight than 1,000 eloquent texts, because it isn't merely quiet, it is irrefutable proof. It demonstrates that the emotional sanctuary they rejected was authentic. It shows that the one person who truly appeared is no longer waiting patiently outside their walls. That realization doesn't strike like a sudden shock. It infiltrates slowly, then consumes all at once. Understand this, it is not your spoken words that transform them. It is your absence. It is the quiet. It is the empty space that amplifies their own inner voice until it drowns out every excuse. You become the thought they cannot escape, the feeling they cannot suppress, the bond they cannot replicate. They grasp their need for you only when you become inaccessible, because until you vanished, they never had to experience your lack. They never had to face the sobering reality of life without you. And for someone who flees from closeness, losing a source of genuine safety is the ultimate jarring awakening. So if you're trapped, wondering why they haven't yet seen your worth, perhaps the answer is startlingly simple. You are still too proximate for them to feel the true distance. Allow them to inhabit the silence. Let them grapple with its emptiness, because in that stillness, truth has nowhere left to conceal itself. Sometimes the most potent statement is made without uttering a single word. Now we must discuss the role of ego, because the avoidance ego is the armor worn to withstand emotional exposure. This ego isn't simple arrogance. It's more fundamental. It's the mechanism by which they maintain a sense of command in relationships without ever revealing their raw, unhealed core. But what transpires when you cease to nourish it? Avoidants are conditioned to crave emotional distance, not from a place of uncaring, but because intimacy threatens their internal equilibrium. When someone draws near, when they feel truly seen, a quiet panic sets in, so they construct barriers. They retract affection, attention, and ultimately communication. Yet they orchestrate this in a manner that preserves their sense of control. They desire the power dynamic tilted in their favor. As long as you are striving, texting, explaining, waiting, they feel secure in that position. Not emotionally secure, but egoically safe. They anticipate your outreach. They know you'll check in. They know you'll remain, even after the chill. And that certainty becomes fuel for their ego, reinforcing the belief that change is unnecessary. But what they never anticipate, what truly destabilizes their system, is when you halt that pattern. When you grow silent, not as a tactic, but because you have finally awakened to your own worth. You stop offering the reassurance they never reciprocated. You stop deciphering their behavior. You stop appearing for someone who refused to meet you halfway, and in that decisive moment, their ego suffers a blow it never saw coming. You must understand, this kind of silence is not just a lack of communication. It is the collapse of their cherished illusion of control, and that is terrifying. Why? Because it forces them to sit with the one fear they've spent a lifetime avoiding, the possibility that they are not, in fact, emotionally self-sufficient, no matter how convincingly they pretend to be. When the ego is no longer fed by your attention, it enters a state of panic because that attention wasn't merely a boost to their confidence, it was the cornerstone of their perceived stability. You were the emotional anchor they pretended not to require. You were the safe harbor they silently depended upon. And when it disappears, they don't just feel bewildered, they feel exposed. This is where the process deepens. When you stop the chase, you compel the avoidant to face an unfamiliar and painful truth that your presence was never the issue. Their inability to receive it was. That realization, if it lands, is agonizing because now they must question not only your worth, but their own behavior, their belief system, their entire identity within relationships. That is the precise moment where the seed of transformation is planted, not always visibly, not always swiftly, but planted nonetheless. The narrative in their mind begins to fracture. They start to wonder why the person they assumed would always be present suddenly isn't. And they begin to comprehend that what they perceived as strength was actually avoidance. And what they perceived as weakness in you, your vulnerability, your love, your steadfastness, was the very strength they feared to embody. This is why silence is not a passive state. It is an active force. It is not punishment. It is reflection. And when enacted from a place of self-respect, not resentment, you cease feeding the ego and begin nourishing the truth. You send a message that cannot be ignored. You will not beg to be valued. So if you've stepped back and they remain motionless, do not waver, do not return. You are not depriving them of love. You are starving their ego of the sustenance it never deserved. When you stop feeding the ego, the soul finally finds its voice. Let's delve deeper into what genuinely occurs when you withdraw, when you go silent and the avoidant is left alone with their thoughts. The common assumption is that this is when they forget you, when they finally feel liberated. But here is what is seldom revealed. That is precisely when the fantasy they've constructed begins to disintegrate. See, avoidants craft internal narratives to rationalize emotional distance. They persuade themselves you are too intense, too sentimental, too clingy. Why? Because if they acknowledged you as safe, as supportive, as profoundly loving, they would have no justification for their retreat. So unconsciously, they distort reality. They twist your essence to safeguard their emotional boundaries. It is not deliberate malice, it is psychological preservation. But here's where it becomes fascinating. The fantasy they built about you only functions while you are present to subconsciously argue against it. When you remain in their life, they can cling to their version of the story because your presence activates their defenses. They interpret your love as pressure, your communication as confrontation, your care as control. The instant you pull back, however, the narrative loses its scaffolding. Now they are alone. And in that solitude, without your energy to react to, something unforeseen happens. The illusion starts to crumble. The story they told themselves about you being too much begins to feel flimsy, hollow, unconvincing, and gradually the truth ascends from beneath the distortion. They recall your patience. They remember how you listened even during their shutdowns. They recollect how you held space for their moods, their inconsistencies, their withdrawals, and suddenly they are no longer observing the version of you constructed from fear. They are starting to glimpse the real you, the one who didn't abandon when things grew difficult, the one who sought clarity, not control, the one who loved them not for a facade, but for their authentic self. That realization is seismic, because now the avoidant is no longer fleeing from you. They are fleeing from themselves, from the shame of repelling something genuine, from the guilt of misjudging someone who only ever desired connection, and most hauntingly, from the question, what if I destroyed something that was actually safe? This is the immense power of silence, not because it inflicts pain, but because it shatters the story they were using as a hiding place. And here is what you must internalize. Fantasy perishes in solitude. When there is no one to blame, no one to project onto, no one to control the narrative with, they begin confronting the truth. And the truth is this: you were never too much. You were too authentic. But by the time they reach that understanding, you are no longer stationed where they left you. You have evolved, you have mended, you have ceased seeking closure from them and started granting it to yourself. And now they are not merely missing you. They are grieving the version of you that would have still chosen them. So if you are residing in the silence right now, questioning whether they are realizing their loss, trust this process. The fantasy is dissolving. And when it finally shatters, what remains is not your fault. It is their lesson. When the illusion breaks, the truth speaks. And the truth is they never lost you. They pushed you away. Here is a concept that may challenge your understanding of this dynamic. They do not begin to miss you while you are there. They begin to miss you the moment you cease being predictable. When you reclaim your energy, when you become unavailable, not as a game, but because your spirit grew weary of being treated as a convenience, that is when the psychological shift occurs. That is when they start contemplating you in an entirely new way. Avoidants are subconsciously wired to devalue what feels overly accessible. It isn't that they lack care. Their nervous system mistakenly equates consistency with a threat. Closeness echoes past experiences where vulnerability led to pain or engulfment. So even if you are loving and grounded, your emotional presence can activate a fear response. That fear then manifests as withdrawal and detachment. Here lies the paradox. The more available you are, the less they consciously register your presence. You blend into the emotional background. You become part of the scenery, safe, constant, and ultimately overlooked. But the moment you pull back, when communication falters and your energy retracts, something stirs within them that they cannot rationalize. Suddenly, the quiet feels oppressive. The stillness feels alien. And that unfamiliarity stirs something deeper than awareness. It stirs longing. You were always there, so they never had to reach. They never had to question. They never had to wonder. That absence of uncertainty fostered a false sense of security, not in the relationship, but in their control over it. Your consistent showing up meant they never had to. But when that dynamic shifts, their mind becomes unsettled. Where did they go? Why aren't they reacting? Is it over? And that is the exact moment you transition from being a comfort they took for granted to a mystery they cannot stop pondering. Because here is what is truly unfolding beneath the surface. When you become less available, you inadvertently trigger the very fear they projected onto you. Now they are the ones sitting with uncertainty. They are the ones wondering if they are forfeiting something meaningful. That anxiety is unfamiliar territory because they have always held the perceived upper hand. But emotional power dynamics are fluid. And when you stop appearing for the version of them that refuses to grow, you cause their entire emotional framework to reset. Do not underestimate the impact this has on someone who assumed they had perpetual access to you. It demolishes the illusion that you are waiting. It disrupts the belief that you will always remain regardless of their treatment. And it forces them to confront a raw, undeniable fact. Your presence was never a guarantee. It was a privilege. And now that privilege has been revoked. You are not attempting to punish them. You are not engaging in manipulation. You are simply reclaiming your emotional sovereignty. And in doing so, you shift from being predictable to profound, from being available to being invaluable, from being seen as a constant to being felt as a loss. This is why they begin thinking of you more intensely the moment you grow silent. Not because they have suddenly changed, but because you have. You broke the cycle. You interrupted the pattern. You created a contrast their psyche cannot ignore. So do not mistake their silence for indifference. The distance they established becomes the very thing that consumes them, because it is not your presence that haunts the avoidant. It is the moment they realize it is no longer theirs to claim. You were never excessive. They were simply unprepared for someone who would not beg to be remembered. Now let's explore a dimension most overlooked entirely, the slow, creeping realization that they didn't merely lose a person, they lost an anchor. You see, avoidants are terrified of emotional reliance, not because they disdain connection, but because connection signifies vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens their cherished illusion of total self-sufficiency. So they keep people at a distance, convinced solitude is superior. But here is a truth they never foresee. They were never as independent as they believed. You were their emotional stabilizer, and they only realize it once you're gone. Let's break this down. Avoidance craves space, but they also crave control within that space. They want connection, but on their terms, their timeline, in doses they can manage. And while they pull away from overt closeness, they quietly rely on your emotional availability to stay grounded. Your presence, your willingness to understand, to show up, to hold steady becomes their emotional safety net, even if they never acknowledge it. They may not express it, but they orbit around it. Subconsciously, they structure their emotional world around your predictability. This is why your silence is so disorienting. When you step out of the equation, when you detach, not from anger, but from clarity, their emotional environment collapses. The chaos they feel isn't just missing you. It's the destabilization of the emotional infrastructure they depended on without ever giving credit. They don't just miss your texts, they miss the certainty behind them. They don't just miss your voice, they miss the safety it gave them. And when that anchor disappears, they're left in emotional freefall. This is where the inner turmoil begins. Not on day 1, not even on day 10, but somewhere in the stillness of your absence, they begin to slowly, silently unravel. It starts with irritation. Why haven't you reached out? Then confusion. Did you really mean that much? Then discomfort. Why does everything feel so off balance without you? Because the truth is, your love wasn't noise. It was structure. It was the thing holding up what they'd convinced themselves they built alone. Now here is the philosophical depth. The human psyche is wired for connection, even in those who fear it. Neuroscience backs this. Our brains are built to bond, and even those who push love away are shaped by its presence. So when love leaves, especially love that's been patient, consistent, and strong, it doesn't just vanish. It echoes. It lingers. It creates a vacuum, and that vacuum becomes unbearable for someone who thought they didn't need anyone. This is why avoidants often circle back, not just to you, but to the version of themselves that felt secure with you. Not because they've suddenly healed, but because without you, they're forced to face what they've been avoiding all along, that the thing they pushed away was the very thing keeping them steady. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean you go running back. This doesn't mean you put your life on pause, waiting for them to realize your worth. It means you recognize the power of your absence, the transformational weight of your silence. You didn't walk away to be chased. You walked away to protect your peace. And in doing so, you became the mirror they couldn't avoid. So if they return, it's not because they suddenly changed overnight. It's because in the silence, they met a part of themselves they never knew existed, the part that needed you. And that's not weakness, that's awakening. The moment they feel your absence is chaos is the moment they realize your presence was their calm. There comes a point, usually long after the silence has settled, when the avoidant begins to realize something they've never wanted to confront. They didn't just miss you, they sabotaged the very connection that could have healed them. And this is where things get brutally real. Avoidants by nature are wired to self-protect. Their nervous system interprets closeness as danger. Vulnerability is exposure. So they run, they shut down, they create distance. But they don't realize that in the process of running from pain, they're running from growth, from intimacy, from love that demands their participation. Because love, real love, isn't passive. It's not built on convenience, it's built on accountability. And that terrifies someone who's been emotionally hiding their whole life. Now here's the twist they never expected. Your silence didn't just disrupt the dynamic, it exposed their sabotage. And when that realization hits, it doesn't just hurt, it shatters them, because now they're face to face with the truth. Not the fantasy, not the projection, but the undeniable fact that you were the one offering something real. You weren't the threat, you were the mirror, you reflected back their potential, you invited them into depth, you gave them a chance to evolve into someone who could receive love, not just avoid it, and they rejected it, not because of you, but because the old self wasn't ready to die. That's the brutal psychology of emotional avoidance. It's not that they didn't want you, it's that they weren't ready to become who they needed to be to keep you. And when they realize that, that's when the shame kicks in, because they didn't lose you randomly. They lost you intentionally through silence, through resistance, through fear disguised as independence. And now they sit in the echo chamber of the decision they made. One you didn't force, but one they orchestrated through their own inability to rise. And it's in that moment of raw, piercing awareness that something cracks. That wall they built around their emotions starts to collapse under the weight of accountability. The realization that it wasn't just fate or bad timing or emotional incompatibility, it was self-sabotage. They had love in their hands and they crushed it with their own resistance. Now let's pause here because this is critical. When someone realizes they destroyed the very thing they prayed for, when they wake up to the pain they caused, not just to you, but to themselves, they enter what psychologists call a rupture, a psychological fracture between who they've been and who they could have been had they chosen courage over comfort. And that fracture doesn't heal easily because it carries the weight of missed opportunities, of burned bridges, of unspoken apologies. But here's the part I want you to hold on to. That rupture isn't your responsibility to fix. That guilt, that grief, that's not your burden to carry. You didn't walk away out of cruelty. You walked away out of self-respect. You didn't cause the pain. They caused it by refusing to grow. Now, your absence isn't just something they feel. It's something they learn from. because your silence taught them what your words never could, that love cannot survive in the shadows of fear. So if they return, it won't be for comfort. It'll be because the old version of them can't live with what they destroyed. Whether or not you let them back in is your choice. But understand this, your evolution didn't happen in spite of their absence. It happened because of it. Sometimes the only way someone wakes up is when they realize they were the villain in a story that was trying to save them. For more insights that help you navigate complex emotional landscapes with wisdom and strength, please support this channel. If this resonated with you, leave a like for Winds of Thought and subscribe for deeper explorations into the psychology of human connection.